That's crazy, isn't it?
And we already have a lazy generation, and it's getting worse.
All right. Well,
We know what it's headed for.
Yeah.
we'll get started. We're gonna be on page 84. Everybody got a book?
Mm-hmm.
We left ours at home.
I got some extra ones around here. Page
I
84.
can't get it on her for nothing.
Oh,
That's page 84.
What is your favorite singer?
oh,
I don't care.
We'll just leave this one back here. And it's a good opening paragraph on that to relate to the lesson. Now this is the return era, and you see on page 84, Tammy, you got it?
I do.
And it's talking about Ezra to Esther, and we also know Nehemiah, and we got him in there, and they're rebuilding the temple and the walls and all that. And let's see, yeah. Now you go to page 84, and you know how it gives a little opening story. I won't just read it the whole way through, but it was talking about Peter Jenkins, and this guy, he walked across America, and it took him 5 years to do it, and he got in all kinds of trouble. He thought one time somebody was trying to kill him, and all kinds of bad weather, but during the process, he also, during that 5 years of walking from New York all the way to the Pacific Ocean, he also got married, and there was also some good things that happened along the way. And then he got to see all the country, and he also got a different perspective. So there was a lot of good things, but there was some bad things too. And then that's how he relates this return era. It was a really good thing because the Israelites got back to God in the right way. And they got back to him in a way that they could worship, and they were spiritually healed, physically healed, they were out of captivity. But they had to go through this process because they got out of the 70 years of captivity, but then they had to go back in and rebuild. And then during that process, it was kind of like, it's kind of like the Exodus and then the 40 years. You had those people coming out of Egypt that were kind of tainted, I guess you'd say, from being in slavery and having everything they wanted to some extent. And then they get out in the desert and they're complaining the whole time. But then guess what happens? They all, God kills them off during that 40 years. They all die. That were 20 years, is it 20 years or 21 years? Anyway, 20 years and up. And then you have this new generation that's got a different respect for God. And so this is what's happening here. And you go down to the last paragraph, and it starts out, it says, the return of the nation of Israel from the 70 years of captivity and the Babylonian parallels in many ways to the story of Peter Jenkins. That was the story what I just kind of paraphrased, the walk across America. And maybe that's what we need in our country. We need to go through some hard times before our people will turn back to God. And that's, it just seems like that's what's going to have to take place before our people will turn back. We're blessed beyond measure. We got everything at our fingertips, jobs, like most people have jobs and homes and all kinds of gadgets, and you just name it, and there's a long list of stuff that everybody's got, and they're just so used to having everything they want, but yet they're not living for the Lord. So maybe God will step in and say, enough's enough. He did that with them, And so here we go. The Israelites went into exile. They were drifting and confused. Remember, they were in all this idol worship, and they got in trouble when God sent the enemy, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, and they spent all these years, 70 years, that's a long time, and it says they returned to Israel a sobered people. So it's like they went through all that bad time, and then when they got out of that, they had a new attitude. And it just seems so parallel to how we are today. It's like these people in our country need a new attitude, don't they? You know, it just seems that it's like they were humbled, and God humbled them, and that I think that's exactly what our people need as a country. But you know, once they got out of that captivity, they had a new attitude, and they're like, man, God helped us to get out of this, and we're focused on building this temple. We're going to build this back right where we can worship, build this wall back for our security. And then you go to 85, and we do the review. I'm going to skip that part tonight and jump over to 86, where we're looking at the expansion and the storyline. Number 2, that storyline summary, Ezra leads the people back from exile to rebuild Jerusalem. Okay, that's
Where are you?
86, page 86.
Oh, okay.
Right there at the top. You got the era, the
Yeah.
figure. The era is going to be the return era, the return. So like in your archway, let's see, we'll go forward here to get, and the archway is on 88, and you'll see it's like 2 people walking and a little kid walking. Number 8, that's the return era. So we've only got just a few more, and we'll be done, you know, all, as far as the different eras in the Old Testament. And so go back to page 86, and the era is the return. The figure is going to be Ezra, and then make sure, yeah, because that's what we're talking about.
And Esther.
And
I thought you said it was Ezra and Esther.
Ezra and Esther, but I don't know. I didn't fill that blank in. I'm looking for it. Hold on.
Esther's one of the.
Yeah, Ezra leads the people back from exile to build Jerusalem, but the era is the return era. We're going to say Ezra is that figure. All right, and the land is going to be going back to Jerusalem. Okay. All right. So, actually, they were going. If you look at the map on 88, they were. It's got Jerusalem marked on that section D, but they were actually in the Persian area, and then they went to Jerusalem, and that mentions that in part of this lesson tonight. All right, let's go back to 86. Ezra leads the people back from exile to rebuild Jerusalem, and then we see in number 3 the expansion. There are 4 major subjects in the return era. You have the disrepair. The disrepair was from the 70 years of neglect. You can imagine if we didn't come to church for 70 years, what the shape of the church would be in.
Yeah.
It looked like that one down the road on Strickland or worse, right? Remember that old one down there? It just would be eat up. The elements would take over, and the animals would take over. I mean, and no kind of maintenance. Yeah, it would fall in on itself. And then number 2, the temple, and then you had the people, and then the rebuilding of the wall. So you got the neglect and the disrepair, the temple, the people, walls. Okay, and so on the first one, we'll see that in Nehemiah, the disrepair. You had the destruction from war and neglect, and it was during the 70 years of captivity. The leadership had been taken into exile, so there's nobody in that area, nobody to work on anything, and it's just in ruins. It falls into disrepair. Not only the city suffered the ravages, the military campaigns, but also fall victim to erosion, neglect. The destruction from war and neglect left Jerusalem in a state of ruin. All right. So when they come back, they had to just start over. It seems like when they're rebuilding stuff, they kind of get focused. You know, when people are working and they're doing that hard labor, and it's just like that's all they can focus on, and it seems like they kind of get their mind focused a little better. It seems that way anyway. All right, now then we look at the temple, and number 2, the rebuilding of the temple in Ezra, chapters 1 through 6. God prompts Cyrus, king of Persia. That's the key thing there, Persia. So in other words, and if you've studied that before, which I know we have, remember Cyrus was willing to help them out. God put it in his heart, just like he can put it in any leader's heart if that's what he wants to happen, and they'll do it. And so that's what we see here, that 7 years was up, and God put it on his heart to help his people to initiate the financing, the rebuilding. So man, he gave them money, materials, time frame. Man, he gave them everything he needed to do it. Under the direction of Zerubbabel, a noted Jewish figure in Persia, the rebuilding of the temple began. And even though, there was some opposition, and remember the story, the Peter Jenkins story at the very beginning, he ran into opposition going across the country in his 5-mile or 5-year walk around the country or going through it. But here we see that there was people around the building and they were trying to stop it around Jerusalem. I mean, it's just the same thing they're doing now. They're trying to keep the Israel people from doing anything over there right now, especially expanding. And so that's what we see here, is they were trying to keep them from rebuilding because they wanted it. They don't want somebody else coming back in there and taking over what they've done, or whatever area they wanted in. But there was some considerable opposition from the Gentiles around that area, urging Haggai, at the urging of Haggai and Zechariah, the two Jewish prophets living in Jerusalem, the restoration of the temple was completed. And if you'll read some of it, I think it was in Nehemiah, and when they were rebuilding the walls, if I remember this correctly, they were rebuilding it, and they would actually have a sword in one hand and the trowel in the other, because they was ready to fight for that. That's the thing. I mean, when it gets down to that, it's like, no, you're not taking this. We're going in here. But God ultimately give it to them, But they knew that they might have to fight for it. And so it's like, well, hey, if we got to do it, we're going to still work on this, but, we need to be ready. So that's the kind of, giving you a little motivation to get stuff done. Put a little fire under you right there when you got somebody trying to kill you.
I'd say.
Or what, you know what I'm saying? It's like, as soon as we get this wall built, we can take a break. All right. You get that wall going a little quicker. All right, now, number 3, it's the people. This is where the spiritual rebuilding, notice the building come first, and we see the building of the temple, because they were wanting to get ready to worship, get the spiritual back. And then we see that in Ezra chapter 7 to 10, rebuilding the temple, direct parallel to the spiritual rebuilding of the Jewish people. That they wanted that temple built so they could worship. All right, and then worship had been discontinued for 70 years. I just can't imagine that. I mean, we went, what was it, a week or so ago without going Wednesday night, and it's kind of like you're off a little bit. You're in that routine of going and worshiping and praying, and then it's like you get cut off for a week or two. It's like, man, whoa, what's happening here? So 70 years, that's just something else. But most of the Jews had never seen or heard the law of Moses. That's how bad it had gotten. And so Ezra, if you go back, Ezra goes back and he starts studying up so he can give it to the people. And so he's studying it to practice it, to teach God's statutes, and to give it to the people. So everybody was in this spiritually just destructive, or I guess disrepair also, but then he gets them back going again. What a time right there that would have been to see that. All right, then the 4th part, we're looking at the walls, the restoration complete. It's like, just for a side note, it's like everything has to be destroyed before we can get things back right again. Is that crazy? But that's what we see, though. It's like God had to get them down to that point, till everything's just gone, and then they look up to God. Is that what we're going to have to get to in this country? I hope not, but just imagine if everything's taken away. Reminds me of being out there, stationed out there in the desert. It was kind of like, you're just sitting out there throwing rocks at each other, and it's like, well, what else can they do? They done shaved their head and put us in the desert. Ain't nothing else they can do.
Lord, he's trying to build it. I know he's trying to get Christian people's attention, but whether they heed it or not, is because I know that we're probably gonna have to suffer some.
Right. I mean, you can kind of see that with this virus that's going around. That's something different that the Lord's allowed in our country. It's got a lot of people nervous. Got, people, I mean, it's a lot of people's died. We don't know really the true numbers on a lot of that. But I think it's going to take a lot more than that to get people's attention as a country, you know. The walls, the restoration of the walls, this is where the security comes in. They had to get the walls built to have that safety and security. Even though, and right there at the first, even though not all the Jews returned when they could have, you see the book of Esther on that, but most of them, many of them are back at Jerusalem. The temple's there, it's restored. It's the dominant structure, but the walls are still broken down. Here we come, Nehemiah comes in as like that project manager, and he comes in, and actually one of my professors used him as an Old Testament project manager. He's like how he came in and he walked around, he figured out what needed to be done, he broke people up in different departments and divisions and got the job done. So it's really interesting to see that from that viewpoint, from like a academic viewpoint as a project manager. But Nehemiah, another Jewish notable, serving Artaxerxes, king of Persia, is burdened to rebuild the walls. He's given permission by the king of Persia, so we see how God's moving in that direction through that government at that time. Short time later, the frame of the noble city of Jerusalem, the home of the temple of God, restoration is complete. And the temple's rebuilt, and the people are rebuilt, and the walls are rebuilt. God just didn't step down and do it for them. He made it a way for them to do it. And that's what we see all throughout the Bible. We see that the people of God serve God.